I was born on July 22nd, 1995, and if you've been following my channel, you'll know that I review all sorts of games that come before that date. There's tons of games older than me that I respect, for the innovations they may have had or the trends they may have started. But the number of these games that I find that can actually go back and still have an incredible time playing with no nostalgia is a small number. Whatever that number is, I'm glad I was able to increment it by one this week, as I finished playing through System Shock.
In my talons, I shape clay, crafting life forms as I please. Around me is a burgeoning empire of steel. From my throne room, lines of power careen into the skies.
Okay, I admit, I cheated a little bit. The exact game I'm playing is not the original System Shock, but instead the enhanced re-release that came to digital distribution in 2015. Not to be confused with the 2016 Kickstarter to totally remake the game from scratch, this enhanced port patched the game to run on modern systems and give the game a modern control scheme. I am being very liberal with the use of the word modern here. These controls are still weird as hell at first. System Shock's original development was created by the team that did Ultima Underworld, and I think looking at the controls in that context helps make them make a lot more sense. Despite the viewpoint, System Shock is not a first-person shooter like Doom, but instead a weird first-person shooter point-and-click adventure game hybrid. You can alternate between a traditional mouse-look mode where you run around and shoot bad guys, but at the click of a button, you can instead have your mouse cursor interact with the environment and UI. While there's definitely a weird curve to get over here at first, you will get over it, and it's a curve worth climbing because the payoff helps you see what they were really trying to do with the world here. In a 1994 interview with GameBytes magazine, programmer Doug Church spoke about some interesting tidbits that drove this game's vision. Some of the first words of this interview talk about how the intent of the game was to, quote, concentrate on making a really immersive 3D world that you can interact with. They wanted to build a world that didn't just look real, but a world that felt real. There were a few different ways that this was accomplished, but the first was an insane level of interactivity. Tons of elements of the world can be clicked on. Buttons can be pressed to open doors, there's working in-game cameras that supervise key areas, items and weapons can be picked up or thrown around. Hell, even the Death Star tier super weapon that the main antagonist is trying to fire at Earth is an interactive object in the world that you can go and click on like everything else, even if that's not a super good idea. More so than just interacting with the world around you, System Shock also begs you to interact with your own UI. I mean, look at this thing, it takes up like over half the screen. There's tons of upgrades and items, and even if some of them can be hotkeyed, you're not realistically going to have enough room either on your keyboard or your brain to house them all unless you dedicate simulation levels of learning time to remember them. This cements the idea that clicking on stuff on your UI is part of the challenge here, whether that's mid-combat to reload your gun and apply a much-needed heal, or if it's to read your in-game emails or look at the map. Do the controls sometimes make the game a little bit clunky to play? Yes. Do they also instill an enhanced sense of horror while you struggle clicking on the interface while simultaneously fighting enemies? Absolutely. The second way in which System Shock gets you sucked into its world is through its awesome presentation. More specifically, its sounds. Greg Piccolo, bassist for the 90s alternative rock band Tribe, composed the soundtrack here. It's a score that somehow manages to instill the mood of weird cyberpunk horror while also feeling like a beat you can easily hear at an EDM club. It's a score that enjoys the distinction of being one of the first great examples of a dynamic soundtrack. Each bit of music for the game's levels was recorded at multiple intensity levels, and depending on certain in-game triggers, such as your proximity to enemies or other hazards, the music would shift to one level of intensity or the other. It may not sound like a huge deal now, but for 1994, this was really groundbreaking stuff. Also on the audio front was Tribe keyboardist Terry Brosius, lending her voice to the game's main antagonist Shodan. It's an iconic performance that will give you chills while you play through the game. Shodan also ties back to the point I was making before about interactive environments. Shodan is a corrupt AI that has taken over the space station where the game takes place. Given her lack of physical body, she impedes the player's progress via other means. She will set up traps by corralling cyborgs into one room and shutting the doors on you when you walk in, or even closing off areas of the station that you would otherwise want to progress through. The entire space station is your enemy, and that helps put you on edge the whole time. You play as an elite hacker who gets commissioned by an important corporate executive to help unlock the true potential of a floating space station's AI. The opening cutscene has you assist him in accomplishing this task, in essence, handing him the keys to the most powerful construct in the world. In exchange for your service, you get fitted with a military-grade cybernetic implant, but are required to go into a comatose state for months during its installation. You wake up on the station to find that maybe handing all the power in the world over to one guy wasn't such a smart move, and now it's your job to right what's been wronged and prevent the destruction of the Earth. It's a simple premise, and you'd be surprised at how few twists and turns the narrative takes from there. The story itself is a very straightforward romp. It's how you unveil that story which is really impressive. Most of the story gets told through exploring the environment and reading through emails and old logs. There's even audio logs left by the station of the crew that help tell their story in a non-linear way depending on the order you uncover them. That's freaking wild. You can even walk around and explore while you listen to them. That's something that BioShock gets commonly praised for, but here's a game doing that exact same thing a decade and a half earlier. That's not the only way that System Shock was wildly ahead of its time. When you start the game, you get the choice of changing the difficulty for each individual aspect of the game. For example, you can make the combat easy but the puzzles hard, or vice versa. That's something modern games are barely scratching the surface on now. I know I'm belaboring this point quite a bit, and while any of these individual items may not feel like quite a lot, it's all of those little luxuries coming together that make the game feel so modern. There's even an in-universe resurrect mechanic where, if you reprogram the cyborg conversion chambers on the floor to healing stations, you won't get game overs anymore when you die, but instead will respawn there. It's funny because I felt for this game super hard, and I think it's a real shame that I didn't play it sooner. I think part of it is because it hasn't been until recently with the Kickstarter and potential third game buzz that the original System Shock is starting to get talked about as much as it should. Looking up System Shock on Google or YouTube will give you way more results about its much more widely played and acclaimed sequel, System Shock 2. Not that that's a problem, but it's a shame because I think this game deserves just as much of a place in the spotlight. I wager part of why it was stuck in cult hit status for so long instead of big hit status for so long was because it was basically abandonware for years. The studio developing the game, Looking Glass Studios, went defunct in May of 2000, and the rights of the game rotted in the hands of an insurance company that sat on it until Night Dive scooped it up in 2015. Yeah, this game, basically the progenitor of the immersive sim genre and emergent gameplay in general, was basically abandonware until a 2015 re-release on GOG and Steam. Prior to that, it was kept afloat by a really passionate fan modding community, which is still actively making updates to this day. I think what may come as a surprise to you, especially considering the types of games that System Shock ended up inspiring, is that this isn't really much of an RPG. All of the upgrades that you unlock in the game are predetermined and can be picked up in the environment. It's a lot like a Metroidvania, at least in that respect, even though the game predates the Vania half of the phrase by like 3 years. There's plenty of roadblocks in the game that wall you off until you reach a certain upgrade, but the cool part is that they're soft walls and not, hard walls. You're expected to get an upgraded environmental protection suit before going into the super radiated grove on the station. But if you stock up on a lot of anti-radiation detox and plan accordingly, you might be able to get away with not having it. And there are plenty of examples like that where a little clever planning will allow you to go at the challenges presented to you in an interesting way. There's enough complexity elsewhere in the game that you'll never really notice the lack of RPG features, but I guess the only real downside to their exclusion is that I'm not exactly salivating to do another immediate playthrough like I usually am with this kind of game, because I don't really think there's anything I'd do differently other than get lost a little bit less. If you've been any level of interested in this game, but have been holding off because you think it's too dated or doesn't hold up, pick it up and give it a try. System Shock deserves not only to be venerated as a benchmark of gaming, but also as a game that is still easy to get sucked into and immersed into today. awesome atmosphere, a highly interactive environment, a radical dynamic soundtrack, and tons of little trend-setting features help System Shock stand out as a game that wasn't just years ahead of its time, but decades.